All right. It's really weird. I'm like videoing over here.
Yeah.
Oh, they're talking to each other. Great. Oh, great. Awesome. They're carrying on a big conversation.
You're not.
Not what?
You're not going to be 50 or half next year.
No, I'm 50 this year.
This is my year.
Yeah, this is trying to go test now.
Who's 50 here?
Lindsay's not.
Lindsay's not. Okay. Press, I just have to ask the press.
Not a 50 year average. She was working full time.
Lindsay?
She accepted a job at Beach Elementary.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Great.
So she'll be doing that and that.
Yes.
He's like more of a.
Oh, yeah.
Where did you walk through the scooters to get the coffee? Or did you drive?
Oh,
Or was that on a?
this is Lindsay's. They made them, they made the group, drive.
I saw the sign.
Most of the time anyway.
Where you can't walk up
Unless
to
she
the
was just
counter.
kind of the dad was there.
I told them they
They
should
have a
have gotten a
connection with
scooter
her.
and went through and they couldn't get out. The scooter.
Which
the
is,
scooter.
you sound like the ones in music school.
Yeah, because it's on speaker mute. So as soon as he comes in and says something.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Control.
And it's recording already.
Oh, we're recording, so I gotta be careful what I say.
Well, I'll be trimming all this, whatever we like right now. Just makes it easier not to have to think there. I'll forget if we don't do it now. I don't.
Unless we want to catch his opening remark.
Yeah, right.
Let's see. Glad you said that because I forgot to turn these guys on. Hey, everybody. Good, you guys can hear me. So did you guys get the link or the email I just sent you guys? Good, okay, so if this doesn't work and you're not able to hear or see, that's okay, because I'm gonna email you the recording. And then you'll be able to see them clearly. So you can try, and if it doesn't work, you'll have backup. And for Ellie, she's probably thinking, good, I wanna go to bed. Same speaking. So let's see, what you guys see on the screen, when Curt Thompson comes on, he's gonna automatically be up there, so he's just gonna appear right in front of you magically.
Straight over this road. It's not like where we went to from there. No, you weren't there, but that was. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, yeah, then I'll just.
Hey, Curt, can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me?
We hear you great.
Great.
Oh, you're moving something?
Just the image of us. There we go.
Okay, I think we're good. And Curt, I really apologize about the time mix-up. I feel so bad about that.
No. Seriously, believe me, it happens. It happens. It's just a thing, and we're good, and we're totally good.
Yeah, I went
I'm
back.
really, you got my. I don't know if you got my text. Like we're totally good, and we don't have to make any time adjustments or rush anything at all. We're good.
Well, great. So you're looking, okay, yeah, you're looking at about half of the room. So I figured we would just do it like this so that you could see who is asking you the questions.
Sure. However you want to do it is fine.
Yeah, I've just got 5 questions that I would like to ask you that pretty much relate directly to this program. This is much easier this year because last year I didn't know what to expect with the program. And now that we've been through all the content, I can be a little more specific with what I ask you. Good. Well, first, for maybe those 1 or 2 people in the room who don't know you, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and just your background and why you ever took an interest in this neuroscience stuff and therapy in the first place?
Sure. So I think probably most importantly to know is just some quick background. I grew up in Ohio. I'm the youngest of 4 sons. My parents were in their mid-40s when I was born, and I had 3 brothers who were all much older than me when I came into the world. And then I have been married for 35 years, and we've got 2 kids, a daughter who's 31 and who is a solo pastor of a small church in Nashville, and a son who's in graduate school. He's 28. And those 3 relationships have been really formational for me, along with, the community of believers that we've been worshiping with now for the last 30 plus years. And then I would also say that, I ended up in medical school and in psychiatry. And it was probably about now 17 or 18 years ago when I first encountered this field of interpersonal neurobiology. This was long before Dan Siegel was Dan Siegel. And he was kind of early. He was early in his kind of writing about this particular thing. And over a period of 2 or 3 years after first encountering it, it became really clear that there was when we were exploring this with patients, we would find that their kind of taking in this work of interpersonal neurobiology was also having great impact on their spiritual relationship with God, their spiritual formation. And so this thing, one thing led to another, in which over the last now 17 or 18 years, this work of interpersonal neurobiology at the intersection of that and Christian spiritual formation has been a lot of what my work has been about. As a clinician, I have over the last 30 years, I practice general psychiatry, and so I do everything from psychopharmacology, intervention for patients, to individual, to couples, group psychotherapy. Have treated adolescents and adults throughout the course of my career. And in the last 5 to 6 years in particular, in our practice, we have really directed our attention much more explicitly on the role of group work. But in our particular version of this, we describe it as confessional communities. We're explicit about that when we talk about it with patients, because the nature of it does include the dynamics of group psychotherapy, but it is also quite intentionally focused with the notion of Christian spiritual formation being in mind. So hopefully that gives people a little idea about what I do. Yeah.
Yeah, now I'm curious to hear about the most difficult patient you ever had to cure, but that's neither here or there. We can talk about the conversation. Well, but on a serious note, though, this program, I think I've told you before, is designed and modeled after the Romans 12 model and be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And we do use your podcasts, and season 1 frames the first few courses in this program. And there are 2 that really stand out to me, and the conversations that we have with the students they're just really neat conversations, and we get to hash it out and talk about it, take it apart. It's your podcast, The Mind, and your podcast, episode 8, Neuroplasticity. I think those are numbers 6 and 8.
Yeah.
And so what I'd kind of like to hear from you is, why do you think, for neuroscience and trauma students, why do you think that it would be important to have an understanding of the mind? And then after you answer that, I'd like to know your thoughts on neuroplasticity and what it means to be renewed and transformed.
Sure. Well, you know, it's really interesting. I'll start my response by stating what was really interesting to me. If you look at the training that one gets in psychiatry, both in medical school and in residency, there was not a single lecture, let alone course, on the notion or nature of what the mind actually is, which is kind of weird, given that we're psychiatrists and we're supposed to be like, this is kind of like the organ. It's kind of like being an orthopedic surgeon who couldn't tell you what makes up a bone. I mean, that's strange.
That is strange.
I mean, I'll still take your money if you want to come to see me, but like, it's still weird that this is the case. And so one of the things that interpersonal neurobiology really does is that it offers, and Dan Siegel likes to talk about, this experience that he had with this group of 40 academics at UCLA who he gathered, this was, again, very early in the game. This would have been in the mid 1990s, when he's asking the question of all these people in the room who each had a stake in identifying what is the mind, because there's lots of debate about what this is. If you were to ask your average person on the street what makes up the mind, most people, I think, would say, well, I think that's the thing that I think with, which is not untrue. And then, but we come to find out that when you ask these 40 people, all these high octane academics, they couldn't come to an easy agreement about what this was. So they had this meeting that lasted for 2 or 3 days, and they're all trying to hash these things out. And at the end of this, Dan worked out what has now become what we would consider to be a working description and explanation, definition of the mind, which you read about in Anatomy of the Soul. When it comes to spiritual formation and when it comes to trauma, then, one of the things that's so important is, if all I imagine the mind to be is the process wherein which I think cognitively, we will end up doing what we've been doing gradually more intensely over the last 500 years as products of modernity, which is I will simply think that all I have to do is think my way out of a problem. Because if I think, if my thinking mind is really all that I have to work with, then that's kind of where I'm going to direct most of my attention. But as it turns out, when we start to pay attention to the reality that the mind is so many other things, this sense of this embodied and relational process and all that definition, then it gives us much greater nuanced awareness and flexibility and capacity to begin to understand, A, what the mind is, and then B, we really have a better sense of what is happening to the mind when we encounter trauma. If all I think that trauma does is kind of disrupt my capacity for thinking correctly, right? I'm overwhelmed with feelings. Well, you just shouldn't pay attention to what you feel. You should just think differently. If I become aware that actually trauma does lots of things to my body, does lots of things to the way I sense and image, let alone what I feel and think and what I want to do impulsively with my body, let alone what trauma does, especially as I think about my mind not being as a thing that just solely belongs to me, but as a function of what's happening between me and you, that trauma isn't just doing something to me, to the degree that it's doing something to me, it's also doing something between you and me. I suddenly discover that there's a whole heck of a lot more going on here that I'm going to need to know what and how to address when it comes to what the mind is. And then when we read the scriptures, and notice Jesus adds to the Deuteronomic record, right? He's the one who adds in the Greek, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Right? The word mind isn't included in the Old Testament versions of this. And for Paul, of course, when you talk about the mind, it's not just what you think, it's all these things that we're talking about. And so when it then comes to how do we enter into the healing of trauma, this is where the second question becomes so crucially helpful and important. When we talk about neuroplasticity, when I was in medical school, if you had a stroke and you're on the ward, the neurological ward after a stroke, you might be on the ward for 6 weeks, and you'd get some physical therapy and some occupational therapy once or twice a day for, an hour, and then we'd send you home and say, good luck. Now, if you have a stroke, we're going to put you in a rehab center where 7 days a week, 10 hours a day, we're going to have you doing all kinds of small exercises over and over and over and over and over again, because we've come to discover what the brain is able to do that 40 years ago we weren't really aware that it could do. And this notion that neuroplastic change, the capacity of the brain to both grow new neurons, create deeper connections between neurons, and also create enlarged neurons, because the size of a neuron, as it turns out from an electrical conduction standpoint, makes a difference. The larger around a neuron is, the more effectively and efficiently it can conduct the kind of impulses that we would want it to. The more we are actually able to enhance neuroplastic change in the direction that we want it to go, the more we are able to actually engage durable, new sensations, images, feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. And so this is where, when we talk about don't be conformed to this world, but instead be transformed by the renewing of your mind, even though Paul wasn't a neuroscientist, we would say that if we were to present him the data of a PET scan and say, this is what we see in the hippocampus when you start to do this kind of work, he would say, well, that of course makes sense to me. we would expect, I could have told you that had I had, medical school training, right? And so this is what's really exciting about this is that the neuroscience, 2,000 years ago, at or around the time that Paul would have been writing this, the notion that we were these separate beings, there's a spiritual world and a material world, it would have been a foreign concept to people who were living at the time. And the notion that we are thinking people over here, and that's really kind of where the world really is, right? What I think about, the abstract world. But the material world is the world that I want to manipulate. But it's not really doing anything to me as much. That's not the spiritual realm. The spiritual realm is over here in some non-material, kind of venue where we kind of put them off to the side. That would have not made sense to Paul. That would have not made sense to a first century Jew. This sense that for them, it's like everything is spiritual in this nature. Anything is spiritual that is moving in the direction of the kingdom of God. What science has done, what we as human beings have done as part of the Enlightenment, is like we've kind of, separated those things. The beauty of interpersonal neurobiology, which people who are studying it, people who are paying attention to it, who are not believers wouldn't even necessarily be aware of this, and that is that the data about interpersonal neurobiology is actually pointing us back to an original way of understanding how human beings were made from a perspective of a biblical concept. This sense that we are a unified body of people, and not only my own body where I sense and image and feel and think, it's a whole thing. All of me is spiritual, but that my spirituality is deeply connected to my interrelationship with you. This whole notion that the body of Christ is not a thing that like I'm creating. This is the Holy Spirit's work. The question for me is like, am I paying attention to what he's doing? In that regard, neuroplastic change that takes place within me is dependent upon my interactions with you. And not only that, to the degree that we do this together, we enhance its ability to take place in each of us and throughout the community. And so again, where the verse that you're talking about is so crucial because as Paul kind of mixes his pronouns, the you is at one level is plural, at one level is singular, that we are all doing this both as individuals and as a community together, that we are being renewed, not just in how I think or imagine or sense things, but I'm also having renewed neuroplastic change in the very course of my physical anatomy, which is it's a beautiful thing. It's as we like to say, we're practicing for heaven.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Thompson, I think you just summed up everything that we need to know. So you guys can go pick up your diploma. They'll just pick up their diplomas at the front door.
Right.
Okay, well, the last time you spoke to our group, there was a question I wish I had asked because many people, even now in this room, have read a lot of your books. And many of us have read your books, and you've got some pretty big fans in the room right now as well. So I would love it if you could tell us a little bit about some of the books that you've read and why you wrote them. Because I've always wanted to hear your heart, what it is that drove you to write some of the things you do to help others.
Yeah. Well, I think there are two parts of my response, and it's very kind to ask you about that. I think the first thing I would say is that I appeal to Acts 17, where Paul's talking to the Laconians, and he says, for generations, God has given you crops and rain, and in this way, he does not leave himself without a witness to you about who he is and about his presence and activity in the world. And at a time when the just kind of preaching of the gospel from the pulpit has less and less of a hearing in the West, what's so striking to me is that God also, even now, does not leave himself without a witness. And the way that neuroscience is showing up is the way it's pointing to the gospel in the very way that we're learning about how the mind works and what a flourishing mind looks like. And so it became like, one aspect of wanting to write the book was just becoming aware and having impressed upon me in my work with patients, it was just so compelling about what was happening, that people were taking what we were learning about neuroscience and it kind of being understood in the context of the gospel, and it was transforming people's lives. And I wasn't making this stuff up. Like this was happening in front of me, and how can you not want to talk about this? And so in some respects, so I started to give lectures. We did a lecture series of this in our Sunday school class and at our church. And we had a former pastor who at the time was a seminary president who was there for one of those classes. And he said, you have to write this stuff. So in that sense, it wasn't first and foremost my idea to do it. I would say you can, you all could go, blame Dennis Hollinger for whatever you like or you don't like. But I think the other thing that seemed to be important is, and this is more of a kind of a, I don't know if this would be strategic or tactical. I don't know. I don't know what those words mean all the time. Which one goes to where? But the reality is, in some respects, every time I would see a new patient, we would say, I want to educate you about here's the framework for what we're doing. And it became clear that it would be helpful to have a book just because it would give greater access for people to have something to read, to return to and reference and so forth. And so my initial kind of target audience, if you will, really were our patient population. I'm thinking whoever's going to be coming to our practice, those are the folks primarily that I would really want them to know about this, because this is the framework for how we're going to do the work that we're doing. And as it turned out, interest was generated in a number of quarters that I could never have anticipated, and that led to some, it's just led to a lot of other opportunities to continue to do the work and to be curious and offer kind of boots on the ground application for these things in a whole range of different settings beyond just the psychiatric practice setting. So it's moved out into lots of different places, and then I think. That was Anatomy of the Soul. And then the next two books, I think really the book on shame came as a direct result of recognizing that in all this work that we're doing, there is this one particular dynamism that plays a particular role that is like no other role that so much of our challenges offer to us. And this grew out of a direct kind of encounter with many patients for whom this issue of shame became the glaring element. This is the thing that was in the room that was having such a profound effect on making it difficult for them to take the steps forward that they wanted to take forward. Even in light of all of what we're learning, we still see that we have this, literally, this neurally embedded payload of embodied neurophysiologic remembered thing that we call shame that continues to haunt us. And that's what led to the second book. And then I think the third, in some respects, grew out of my own, my own growth. That has continued. You know, you write these books and then you're like, oh, I actually have to deal with my own shame. I was nice to write. I thought I could just write that and like let it go. But now I gotta now I gotta deal with this stuff. And I think the whole notion of, imagining that shame isn't just something that I want to get rid of. This whole notion that what evil is doing most effectively and most poignantly is that evil wants to use shame to keep us from bearing God's image as creators, as makers, as those who are creating beauty and goodness in the world, relationally and in the material world, in an infinite number of ways, on the way to our actually becoming that very beauty. And I think in many respects, in the book on shame, I tried to provide some imagined way with this whole notion of a cloud of witnesses, of like how we first begin to really respond to it. I think in the book on beauty, I try to extend that, I think, even further and say, and this is where we're actually headed with that. We gather with this cloud of witnesses, but what we're really looking for is that we're really practicing for heaven. And that practicing for heaven, we're not just trying to rid ourselves of feeling bad. We're not just trying to rid ourselves of our sin. All that is true, but there is this sense in which God is really quite serious of bringing his creation to a consummated place. He wants this thing to be what he wanted it and intended it to be in the end. His mission is not just to come and save a bunch of knuckleheads from their sin, because he's got nothing better to do with his time, and that's the way it's supposed to work out. There is this sense that we are living in this story, this grand story, and it's a story that is anathema to evil, and evil is doing everything it can to undermine it. And I don't know if that's what you wanted me to say answering this question, but there you go. That's why about the books.
Hey, I am just going to say that I really love that you brought up the idea of living out our identity in God as being created in his image as creators ourselves. Mm-hmm. That's a beautiful concept in and of itself. And I just love it. You're one of the first people that ever had make that idea clear. And I love it. Yeah. Well, I think I'll just say too, this gets back to the whole notion. I'll say this, there's along the way, all this, anything that I've written, as we like to say, there's nothing new under the sun. This is Ecclesiastes. And anything that you've read in my work that feels or sounds new, I would say, well, you probably just haven't, we haven't gone far enough back into patristics or wherever it is that I'm sure it's someplace. Now, maybe not about, PET scans, because, I don't think, St. John of the Cross had PET scans to access, or Aquinas or any of those cats. But there is this sense that I've just been so moved.
I've been influenced by other people who have like who I've read who have just like I'm like, oh my gosh. So this, you know, the Catholic theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar, a name itself that if you can pronounce it like then you get an A.
That
Okay.
was awesome, right? You did a great
Right.
job.
Okay. Right. This is a guy who 10 years ago, like I didn't even know the guy had ever existed, but as it turns out, he's probably one of the, if not the most prominent Catholic theologians of the 20th century, a Swiss guy who just wrote things that like, I don't even read him. I have to read Aidan Nichols, who writes about him. I mean, this is how like brilliant he is. And von Balthasar was famous for saying, he would say like, look, if you look at philosophy, philosophy in the West has often followed this pattern where first we want to know what is truth, what is true. And what is true, then once we know what is true, that defines the premises for what goodness is. And that then sets the parameters for what we are allowed beauty to be. And then von Balthasar comes along and says, you know, that's all backwards. Because the reality is that, and what was so really captivating to me about his work is that everything he says is completely consistent with how the brain actually works. When he says that beauty is the way our senses first encounter what goodness is. And once we have a physical encounter with beauty, it draws us to what goodness is. And once we're engaged with goodness long enough, that is what will tell us what is true in the world. Which is the way that and again, you know, on this question of trauma, we like to say that when it comes to the brain, first we sense and then we make sense of what we sense. Trauma primarily is first and foremost a disruption of my capacity to regulate my physically engaged affective states. My cognitive states to be sure, but most of what makes my cognition so difficult is that I can't regulate my body. And von Balthasar comes along and says, right, and if we are paying attention to beauty, if we actually submit ourselves to beauty, that very action can draw us into a space where we can be more at peace, more at ease. Now, he wouldn't say this because he's not a neuroscientist, but I would say it allows your autonomic nervous system to remain much further within what we would call the window of tolerance. Y'all will read about that, I'm sure, at some point.
Yep, you will.
And in that regard, it then allows you to exhale. It allows you to start to pay attention to things you otherwise aren't able to pay attention to. And then begin to answer the question, what do I want and what do I want to make? And if I'm not in the business of being able to regularly do that, at some point, my brain is going to know that there's a problem. And it's going to get anxious. And as we like to say, depression is actually what happens when I can no longer manage my anxiety. And now I've once again gone way off the grid from where you're asking your questions. So I'll stop.
I enjoy that a lot, so keep doing it. Well, of the books that you've written, I think I told you that we are using Anatomy of the Soul to frame the second half of our kind of faith integration, spiritual development, and a whole bunch of other works and discussions kind of flow out of that. Mm-hmm. And so knowing that about this program, what would you hope that our students would actually leave with or have as a result of reading Anatomy of the Soul?
Well, I think the first thing is that I would want you to tell as many people as you know that they should go buy a copy. That's the first thing that they should.
Guilty.
They should do. That's what they should do. 3 or 4 copies if you're really feeling game for that.
Spoken like a true author.
Yeah. That's right. You know, I would say, you know, one of the phrases that I have been recently using in the training that we do in these confessional communities that we're beginning to run and make available for people, is that when you look at the arc of the biblical narrative from beginning to end, what you see is this dance between and an expansion of a movement between imagination toward incarnation. This notion, and here's what I mean by that. We like to say that as far as the brain is concerned, when it comes to any intentional human behavior, there's nothing that we do with intention that we don't first imagine doing, even if the imagined act is taking place nano to microseconds ahead of the intended activity. And so one of the things that we do all the time is, of course, we live all kinds of our life, a whole part of our life, like on autopilot. And it is an autopilot. Evil's counting on us doing that. Evil is counting on us remaining, unaware of what it is that we're doing. I think that one of the things that many people have said to me that they found to be helpful about Anatomy of the Soul is that it was a book that began to give them language for things that they had been experiencing for some time, kind of intuitively knew, but weren't really aware that they knew. But then they began to pay attention to it because they were starting to have language and ways of framing what their experience was. But it also gave them language and an understanding of how, if I want my life to be different, what are the things that I can begin to pay attention to and move with intentionality, with intended action into those places where I want to live differently. I want to become a person of greater love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, all those things. But to do that, I first have to imagine it. And so the one thing that I would hope that would happen from the use of this book is that we would have our imaginations enlarged in order for us then to place those things that we are imagining into embodied practice. We move from imagination to incarnation. In the same way that if you move from Genesis to Revelation, what we find is that there is a movement of God every single time he has an encounter with somebody in the Bible. He's asking that particular person to expand their imagination of him. Like in the Old Testament, when you move from Abraham to Moses to Joshua to Samuel to David to the prophets, God is asking people to trust a God that like 200 years before he's asking them to step out of the box with him. They can't keep him in a box, right? The very, like Abraham did, like we're going to Canaan together. Like, what's this? I don't get that. I'm going to have a kid. I'm going to have a kid. Like I can barely, I can't get an erection, let alone get a kid. Like how's this going to happen? Right? Like I'm 75 years old. How's this? Are we allowed to say that in this class? Are we allowed to say that word?
Just did.
Okay, right, yeah, okay. Right. I hope this is not being recorded, that the president of your university is not going to be listening in on this. Okay.
Direction's not a cuss word, so you're okay.
Okay, well, I can do that later. Okay, so.
I think you did that last year.
Okay, I will, okay. But the point is that even by the time that you get to the prophets, right, the Hebrews, they only understood, as many Eastern cultic religious groups understood, like God was only as strong as the most recent battle your soldiers had won. This was not a God that was making any sense to the Hebrews when they are carted off to Babylon. Their God would have been as good as dead. I mean, this is the way of gods. This is what would happen to gods. If your army's bigger and badder than mine, then my God submits, and like my God stops really having a thing. And then I'm going to take on your gods. And the prophets were writing things that were actually asking people to expand their imagination. But then you get to Jesus and you talk about expanding imagination. But how is he able to do that? Because he is incarnate. Like he is the most embodied God with us thing people have seen. And when he shows up, he's now like blowing people's imaginations like out of the water. Like, well, what do you mean? Like we destroy the temple in 3 days. Like, I don't get it. Right. And then after the resurrection, now you've got all these people who have to reimagine Old Testament texts like the suffering servant texts. Like the whole notion that a Messiah would be crucified, like that makes no sense to any Jew. And then the whole notion of Pentecost, that God would live in us And so now the incarnation is not just Jesus, but it's the Holy Spirit. I become the representation of the incarnation of God in the world. Like this is stuff that we have become it's so innocuous to us because we read it as a text. It remains in the abstract sense of our minds. Yeah. It's theology. It's these, but the notion that one would wake up in the morning and be curious about, like, oh my gosh, like the Spirit of God is literally in my body, and He's in my bedroom. I hope He didn't mind that I got up and I only had my underwear on today. Like, I hope this is not a problem for Him. But I'm really serious. Like we don't pause long enough to take these kinds of imagined things seriously. But when we do, it changes categorically the way we incarnate the presence of the Holy Spirit when I walk out of my front door in the morning. And this is crucially important when it comes to trauma. Because one of the things that we say about what trauma does is that it doesn't just shatter my sense of my story. It shatters the mechanism by which I understand the nature of what has actually even happened to me and what it is that I can do to have a different story in the wake of my trauma. And for many trauma victims, their capacity to imagine beauty and goodness in the world is it is literally shattered. And part of what the healing of trauma entails is that those victims of trauma need somebody else in the room to, in an incarnated way, imagine what is true for the traumatized victim until their imagination can catch up. And this is exactly what Jesus was doing with the disciples. This is exactly what Jeremiah was doing to his listeners. This is exactly what God was doing with Moses. Imagining things on behalf of the other, waiting for the other's imagination to catch up. And God is not in a hurry, obviously. He's waiting for my imagination to catch up, and it's taken Him and me a long time. And so He's not worried about the pace. But this is, I would say this is an important thing, because I would then want for the students to allow Anatomy of the Soul to be something that actually fires your imagination, activates your imagination, invites you to imagine things you haven't imagined before, in order for God to enable that imagined future that is different to now find ways to be embodied and to become incarnate. Okay, I'll stop with that.
And that's a good place to stop. I'm actually taking notes on that, because I'm going to bring our conversations about Anatomy of Soul back to that when we're having our actual conversations. There's so much there in what you just said that I almost want us just to pause and just kind of take that. But I know you have a dinner to get to.
Oh, so, no, wait. Okay, don't we have another 30 minutes?
We do, but I did want to try to get you to your dinner.
Oh, wait. Okay, so all right, look. If you and I have to have a psychotherapy session right here now, like, I'm happy to do it.
Wait, is it going to be?
I'm happy to do it. I'm not even going to charge you. I'm just going to say. I'm just going to say what like I'm totally good until 5:30. Like, we're totally good. Well, but maybe this is your very kind way of saying, Curt, we'd like you to stop talking. We really want this to be over.
No way. Okay, so when I was 3 years old, I experienced
Okay.
trauma.
Okay, I've been waiting for this moment. Let's get after it.
Actually, no, let's go back to attachment and attunement. When I was 2 months old.
Okay. I'll say this, right? So I have a friend who I would consider to be my spiritual mother. Her name is Ann Halley. She's in her mid-70s. And I could say many things about this woman. And I was listening to her give a lecture in which she made this comment that secure attachment is all about the newborn and the infant becoming increasingly aware of the increasing awareness of the parent. Right? That the newborn is becoming increasingly aware of the increasing awareness of the parent. And for most of us, I mean, you know, trauma happens in the first place because somebody isn't paying attention to, nor are they being aware of the presence of the one who's being traumatized. I'm just going to steamroll them. I'm not thinking about them at all. And the healing of trauma takes place when those parts of us that have been traumatized, and I would say that for everybody here in the room, we each have some part that has experienced some kind of trauma, even if it's in some small way, that we have worked really hard to protect, sometimes by just simply, you know, asking it to go away, keeping it out of our conscious awareness, exiling it, right? As Richard Schwartz would say in Internal Family Systems, we're just going to get rid of it. We're going to have to burn energy to do that. That is energy that I don't have available to create beauty and goodness in the world. But I would say that one of the most important things that's going to happen over the course of your year together, and that I would anticipate, is everyone's growth in your awareness of someone else's growing awareness of you. And that the awareness that they are directing toward you is being done so with loving kindness. Now, this loving kindness, I want to be clear, the loving kindness of a parent is not that which says to the newborn or infant or toddler, you may have whatever you want, however you want it, whenever you want it. Loving kindness sets limits. Loving kindness says no. Loving kindness is curious about the child's behavior that has been actually shameful, right? You know, people will sometimes ask like me, well, is there anything in the, any role that shame plays that's helpful? I say, absolutely, right? There are behaviors that human beings conduct for which shame is the appropriate response. Yeah. But the purpose of shame is not to get us to feel bad. The purpose of shame is to get our attention, to turn us toward relationship. The problem with it is that neurophysiologically, it doesn't have me doing that very easily. I want to turn away from you, which is why when it comes to shame, I need somebody to come find me. And so even when a child is ashamed, secure attachment often is being strengthened when the parent, their attunement to the child is growing, even when the child is trying to turn away from the parent, or the employee is turning away from the boss, or the parishioner is turning away from the pastor. We're turning away from God. This notion that we want to become increasingly attuned to another's attunement to us, even when it means I'm going to be hauling some things out that I worry that if you see, you're going to leave the room and never come back. And I think that so much of our capacity to be helpful for those who've been traumatized is directly related to the degree to which those parts of us that have been traumatized are also that we are addressing those with someone else. We can't give people what we don't have. And so to that end, I'm also eager for this group to not just learn things in the course of their work, in the course of this 1 year course, but that they literally, it's like we say, whenever I go to train people, I say look, whether it's, an hour or 3 days, I said, at the end of our time, you're not going to be any smarter, which of course, people then say, well, so why are we paying you any money if we're not going to be any smarter? It doesn't make any sense. And I said, because my job is not to make you smarter. My job is to be with you and to inspire you to do the work that we have to do. But it is work. Here's the other thing it's important to know. It will be tempting to think that I'm going to enter into this master's degree program, and the program itself is this kind of siloed thing that I do that is separate from my real life. And I'm going to come learn these things in this program, and then I'm going to take those things out of this program and apply that to my real life. And what I want to invite people to consider and to imagine, as it were, that there's not going to be a single thing that you're doing in this program, even this time that we're spending right now. There is not a single moment in which the Holy Spirit is not looking for a way in, is not looking to move, is not looking to transform, is not looking to kind of open a door here, a window there, perhaps into a space in our own heart and mind that we haven't looked at before, because he is like, because you're not a problem to solve. You are an artifact of beauty that is waiting to emerge. This is Michelangelo's Pietà. You've got 8,000 pounds of marble, and it turns into 6,000 pounds of marble because Michelangelo had to go find Mary and Jesus in the block of marble. And this is what God is doing with you in the program. Not just doing it like, you're not just like learning tools so that you can go do that outside the program. Okay, I'll stop with that.
Yeah, and you know, that's actually a big deal to us because we literally pray that God brings us the right people that want to come here to be transformed so that they can go transform others. And we care more about who they are when they leave than what they know.
Yeah.
And something you said, I hope this isn't completely out of left field, but some of the activities they've been doing here this weekend is spending time listening. And in particular, one was to think about your questions I've given you so you have answers. And some of them have been pretty poignant. So that they know their answers, so that when they get in their groups, they can really focus and make eye contact and hear the person that is speaking. So could you tell us your thoughts on the importance of being heard as it relates to relationships and therapy and healing?
Yeah. Well, again, I think I'll pan the camera back and say, you know, one of the questions that we ask people on a regular basis is, in what story do you believe you're living? And that's not a question that is designed to be abstract in the question nor in the answer. When you read the biblical text, you come to understand that we're in the middle of a story. Like that's where we are. But most of us aren't paying much attention to that fact. We're kind of on autopilot, kind of getting through our day. And then there is this thing called spirituality and this relationship I have with Jesus. And I'm hoping to like make sure that I do that pretty well today. But the whole notion that I'm actually in the middle of Lord of the Rings, that I'm actually in the middle of War and Peace, that I'm actually in the middle of a grand narrative, is a big deal, because what we come to discover is that the Bible largely is a story. There's instruction in it. There's all kinds of things in it, but it is mostly the story that we are living in. And part of what it means for us as humans, the thing that we do that, as far as we know, unless, you know, that separates us from animals, unless you're in a C.S. Lewis novel, like we tell stories. No other animal, I already know what I'm going to order at this restaurant that we're going to go to tonight, because I have a memory of what we had the last time, and I really like this restaurant, and it's going to be a lovely place to go. I can guarantee you, like, you know, when it comes to like the fall, the elk in Jackson Hole are not having conversations with other elk about what last year's harvest was like. They're not doing that, as far as we know. But why is this important? Because we are storytellers. We are telling stories all the time. So when it comes to the question of like, why is it important for us to be heard? That begs the question, well, what is it that we're going to be hearing? And what we need to be heard, we say, right? Everybody comes into the world looking for someone, looking for them, because I'm looking to tell you about who I am. The Bible is God trying to tell us who he is. We just have a hard time listening and paying attention. And we long to tell others. A 3-year-old runs into your kitchen holding a piece of paper that they've drawn with their colors. They're not just showing you their artwork. They're trying to tell you something. And they want you to listen. And so this notion of being heard is not just a thing that I need to be able to do to heal my trauma. I need this to be a human. And part of the problem is that so much of my story is tangled up with my trauma, that most of my life is spent telling a story that is authored much more so by my shame than it is by the notion that I'm a piece of artwork that is waiting to emerge. And if that's going to be different, if my story is going to be changed, if I'm going to tell a truer version of my story, I'm going to have to be, first of all, human beings do not self-identify. Human beings don't ever tell their story on their own, by themselves. It's impossible for us to do it. We are always telling our stories collaboratively. Like we like in The Soul of Shame, like we talked about this, right? This notion that your story began like long before you were born, when your parents knew that you were conceived, right? They start to talk about you. They have plans for you. They imagine like who your friends are going to be and the clothes that you're going to wear, all the things that you would never agree to if you had been in on the conversation. Like they're telling a story about you. They're telling a story about you. And even then after you're born, they continue to tell a story. Like they decide where you're going to go to school. They decide like who your playmates are going to be, even if you don't like them, but they're going to decide these things. Our stories are always told collaboratively, and that never stops. The older we get, the more in charge we become of the story, but we never tell them without other people's voices banging around in our head. And so the question is always, who are the people who are listening to me, who are enabling me to tell my story? When we are heard by others who themselves also long to be part of a storytelling venture that is truer, that is more faithful to the vision of who we are called to become, I then am able to discern things about my story that I didn't know I didn't know. When you have the conversation with somebody and they tell you something about, their relationship with their dad, and, they're telling you with a straight face, and you hear that story and you're infuriated because you can't imagine how it is that they're telling you with a straight face something that their dad did. And like everybody in the room is really pissed off. But like the person who's telling the story, they're just talking about like they're watching paint dry. And you say, wait a minute, like you look like you're watching paint dry. But like, I'm furious at your dad. And they're going to look at you and say like, what is there to be angry about? Because they have been working all their life to confine and contain their anger because it was too dangerous in their house to name it, despite the fact that anger is exactly what their response to their father's bad behavior would necessarily have been. But they can't tell that story until they see their anger identified in your voice and eyes and body language. And so when you begin to hear them, when they are heard, even when they don't know they're being heard, and you start to offer a response to something that is within them that they don't even know they have access to, this is how their story becomes told more truly, and you become a part of that storytelling venture. We like to say that anytime somebody's telling their story, the listener is as much a teller of the story as the teller themselves is. And then if the listener isn't listening very well, the story isn't going to get told very well. And the storyteller is going to have that experience. And one more time, like I'll be convinced that my story doesn't really matter, which is why I don't tell people. And on and on and on. And so the whole notion of being heard is important because as I am heard, I learn more things about me that I can't know unless you are helping me tell my story. And to that end, and when we trust that the Holy Spirit is in on this, the Holy Spirit is actually like responsible for this storytelling, that the Holy Spirit is moving everything to a truer place, then I can include the parts of me that yesterday I didn't even know that existed. The part of me that I'm so ashamed of, for instance, that I keep out of the room. But what happens when I finally allow that part of me into the room? I welcome that part of me into the room. I'm not going to be enraged with that part of me. Instead, I'm going to welcome it and I'm going to forgive it and I'm going to treat it differently. And I'm not just going to treat it differently because I get to do it. I'm going to treat it differently because Sam, who's also in the room listening to this, me talk about this, Sam has been merciful to this part, which like I'm still trying to get my head around because I've spent 50 years being mad at this part of me. This will take practice. This will take many, many times me coming back into the room and talking about this part and Sam saying, yep, I'm still really glad that that part of you, Curt, is in the room. Because I'm not just going to, I don't just need to have that part of my story heard one time, right? You figure the Hebrews use the Psalms publicly to pray. Why do they need 150 of them? Like, you need 150 poems? Like, that's just a lot of time. That's a lot of ink on the sheepskin. Like, I don't get it, right? Why? Like maybe 5, maybe 10. Oh, we can do 10 Psalms. That's all we need. No, it's like it's 150 Psalms. They leave no stone unturned in terms of the human experience. And there are many, many Psalms that like just ditto, 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 ditto. Like they're repeating the same thing over and over again. Like, why do you got to just keep repeating this? Because they were people who believed in a God who welcomed their talking about their story for as long as they needed to tell it. We like to tell people, look, if you know much about children, if you can imagine a 2-year-old. I don't know how many of you have children. If you have children, if you have a 2-year-old, if you ever had one, and they're playing or whatever, and they fall down and skin their knee, and they come running to you, and they're upset, you don't know if they're going to want to be in your lap for 15 seconds or 15 minutes. Because there are all kinds of other confounding factors that are going to be deciding whether or not they're going to cry for 15 seconds or 15 minutes. Are they hungry? Do they need a nap? You know, was it their sibling that pushed them down? All the things that happen. And we serve a God who never runs out of time. We serve a God who's not on a watch, who doesn't say, like, look, I got to get to work. Like, we are the work for God. And he's glad that he gets to do it.
You know, I have one more question for you, but I think that's a great place to end. And it has been an hour because we started early with you. But
Okay, so we have 10 minutes, but we can do what you want to do, man. It's up to you.
Well, maybe I could ask you one last question, because these students are going to progress through the program over a little more than a year with me for 1.25 years. And they're going to start out learning about what a healthy, regulated brain looks like and how they function best. And in what environment. Then we start introducing trauma and talk about what trauma does. And then we start doing a little behavior analysis type things. And we start talking about current trends and things that people are doing that are successful. And we end with moving into how to develop trauma-informed learning communities. What would be the one piece of advice that you would have for these students in this room? Say they were your child in a master's program. What advice would you give to them over this next year?
I think I would say a couple things. And I think I would probably say that what I'm offering is my longing, not even my advice, because I don't really trust my advice very well. I mean, I would just, but I can tell you what I long for people. I would long for you to become ever deeply. You're going to learn a lot. What we like to say when we talk about the information, about all the things that you're going to engage over the next year and a quarter. When I talk about information, I say, like, you're going to learn a lot about the mechanics of life. You know, a lot about the mechanics of life. What is a healthy mind? What is a traumatized mind? What are the things that we do to help heal that? A lot of the mechanics, all that are absolutely necessary. And I would say that along the way, we are going to discover that we are going to, and we're learning those mechanics because we have a vision. Like, you wouldn't be in this class if at some point in the back of your mind, you yourselves didn't have a longing for something beyond this course. There's something about this that calls you, something about this that intrigues you, something about this that compels you, that captivates you. And you have some inkling of a vision about where you want your life to be when you're done, what you hope to do with this information about the mechanics when you're done, all those kinds of things, which is beautiful. And I would long for you, to, on that journey, practice remembering a couple of things. One is that the degree to which we're actually able to incorporate these mechanics and apply them has everything to do with the degree to which we are living and breathing with the deep awareness of the affection of our King. Children are enabled to go and do hard things because they are going to do them with the awareness of the affection of their mother and their father. That their mother and their father are with them and are going to come for them when hard things happen. And that means that they're even aware of the deep affection and permanence and commitment of their father and mother to them, of our King to us, even when we make mistakes, even when we don't perfectly incorporate the mechanics, even when I thought I knew the mechanics or I thought I knew about that, but somehow that still got away from me and I forgot that, or I like acted out again in ways that I wish I hadn't, or all the things. I'm trying to take this stuff in. I'm trying to, as we like to say, we ingest things, which is what you ingest something in a matter of minutes, right? If you're sitting for a meal, you ingest the meal we measure it in minutes, right? It could be 30 minutes, it could be 60 minutes, but we measure it in minutes. We digest something of a period of hours. You're going to be ingesting things over the course of this year and a quarter, relatively speaking, metaphor in the course of minutes. You're going to be digesting things, relatively speaking, in the course of hours. And that's going to take time. And so here's the other thing that I want you to consider, that in the next year and a half, you're going to be doing something that is going to feel like you're digesting stuff. It's going to take time. And we're going to do it imperfectly. And it's okay, because we're paying attention to the deep and lasting affection of the King. But it is a thing that we must practice every single day, several times a day, because evil is going to take advantage of any moment that you turn away from it. Evil is going to call on all of your old neural networks that represent your own shame and traumatized stories, and it's going to want to use them to combat any beauty and goodness that you're taking in the course of this course. And then there's the last part, which is that we ingest, we digest, and then we metabolize. And metabolism in the human body is something that takes place over days, weeks, months, years, the rest of our life. And so I want you to be of good cheer in recognizing that this is the kind of course we when I'm doing training work for people, we had a training session for a group of about 20 in our practice on Thursday and Friday. And I said, what we're doing here in these 2 days, what we're doing here is like the first stage of a Saturn V rocket. Now, some of you all in the room might be familiar with a Saturn V rocket. Some of you may have no idea what that is, but this is the rocket that we use when we were sending people to the moon. And there's no more powerful rocket that's ever been built anywhere, because it had a long way to go. And it had to get people to a certain place. It had to get people off the launch pad. But the first stage of the rocket was just intended to do that. It needed to get people off the launch pad. It needed to get the rocket free of Earth's gravitational pull. But that first stage was not getting people to the moon. This kind of coursework is like the first couple stages of the Saturn V rocket. And so I want you to be open to God's loving kindness with how long it's going to take for you to take this stuff in, to ingest, digest, and metabolize this. You're going to do this for a year and a quarter, and you're going to use it until you're dead. And that is a most beautiful thing. And it all begins and ends with our awareness of abiding in Jesus, attuning to being the branch that's connected to the vine, while we're practicing for heaven that's here and that is coming.
Well, before we let you go, I want to say something to you. Because we did frame the program from a faith integration standpoint around podcasts in your book. And so this is going to sound really weird coming from me, because we only had a few conversations. So I hope this doesn't sound really, I don't want to be that creeper guy, but this is gonna sound a little weird to you.
No, could you please say more about why you think it might be a creeper guy thing happening? I'm enjoying. Can I like even before you say what you're going to say? I'm kind of having some fun just listening to all about the creeper stuff.
Yeah, but I do want to say, I want to say this sincerely, because if you could have seen the impact you had on my students, and if you could have seen some of the discussions we had and some of the feedback I've gotten about what they were learning from you, it's caused me to love you. And I really do love you. So I just want to say,
wow,
thank you for the time you take to affect our students. Thank you for the way you love people. Thank you for your example. We appreciate you. I appreciate you more than you know. And we really don't even know each other. And if we never meet each other on this planet, we're going to be brothers in heaven forever. And I love that.
Dude. Okay, wait. Okay, so my wife makes the second best black raspberry pie on the planet. Because I do have to say that my memory is that my mother made
somebody just said who makes the best
killer. Like, okay, but my wife just makes an unbelievably killer. And one of the problems with this is that I encountered the conflict of like, after the first bite, I just want to eat half the pie in the next like 60 seconds. It's that good. But the conflict also is because I also want every bite that I take, I don't ever really want to swallow it because it's just so worth savoring. And I want to do that with your words. So I'm just taking them in, and I'm really grateful. They just I'm just really moved, and so I'm glad I will take you. I hope that my friends with whom I'm having dinner tonight don't mind that you're going to be joining us at the table, because it will be easy for me to introduce you to them, and so I'm just really grateful. So thank you. Thank you for. It's been very humbling to be invited, and to be. I love the conversation that we get to have. I mean, and with it, it's so full of joy and laughter and goodness. And I don't deserve my life, and this is and you and this class and these students and is just a significant part of why that's true. So I'm really grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a great way to end our weekend together. We really appreciate you. Yeah. And I appreciate you changing the time for us and accommodating.
Oh, no, it's all good.
Good. Well, thank you very much. It's good to see you again.
You're welcome. Right on. And best to all of you.
Appreciation.
All right.
Thanks, Curt.
All right. We'll see you.
See ya. You tired? And we're not done yet. We still have